He's never felt this afraid before, as the long, bony hand reaches for him. All that twisted, naked flesh, the long body, the straggly black hair, her sharp teeth and bloodshot saucer eyes staring. Is that horror or desire? He feels the sweat stand proud on his skin. He shakes. He is in the grip of a living nightmare, and not long ago, it was just alone in its cell. The young man wasn't sure what to expect when he took a job as a security guard at the SCP Foundation. His brother, a researcher at the secretive organization, had stuck his neck out to get him the job, personally vouching for his reliability and character. With a promise of competence, loyalty, and above all discretion, he was hired. While he filled out the hiring paperwork, his brother warned him that he might see things at this job, things he would never be able to forget. So as he arrived at the research and containment site for his first day, his mind raced with possibilities. Would he be assigned to guard that giant murder lizard his brother had described? Or that statue that you have to stare at it, or else it snaps your neck in a split second? His heart was pounding as he waited for his first assignment. But when the head of security told him he would just be watching a live video feed of a newly acquired subject, he relaxed a little. When he found out that it would be a live video feed of an empty room with nothing in it but a doll, he let out all the tension and anxiety in one big whoosh of breath. A doll? Seriously? His brother had freaked him out for nothing. This was going to be a piece of cake, or so he thought. He wouldn't know how wrong he was until it was too late. He was ushered into a small windowless room, sparsely furnished with nothing but a monitor, a small desk, and a worn office chair. The security head presses a button on the monitor, and the screen comes to life. As promised, it's a live video feed of the containment room next door, and there in the center of the room is the subject, a doll. What's so special about this thing anyway? The guard asks his boss, but the older man simply shrugged and left him alone with the monitor and a dozen unanswered questions. The young guard peered at the screen, at the doll sitting alone in its room. It was about 6 inches tall, made from clay or maybe wood. The video quality wasn't clear enough to know for sure. When he asked what he was supposed to be looking for, he was just told to keep an eye on things and watch for signs of a potential containment breach. But come on, what kind of breach? It's not as if a doll can make much trouble. But even so, as he looked at this little figure, a crude figure of a woman sculpted from something dark, reddish, brown, he felt a little nervous. He couldn't articulate why, but the doll gave him a bad feeling. At first, he refused to look at it for very long, averting his eyes to look at the clock, his hands, the ceiling. But avoiding the doll only worsened his anxiety. He knew it was probably irrational, but he couldn't help but worry it would move while he wasn't looking. He imagined turning his gaze back to the monitor to find that the doll had crept forward, carved face inches from the camera. But when he did look back at it, the thing hadn't budged, not 1 inch. He wished they had given him a bit more information so he knew what to expect. Instead, he just had to drift into the unknown, waiting for something horrible to happen at any moment. Or maybe this was some kind of hazing ritual, and the thing really was just an ordinary doll. Maybe the other security guards were sitting in the room next door, laughing at the idiot freaking himself out over a doll. But maybe not. He wasn't keeping track of the time, but if he had been, he would have noticed that he had been observing the doll without looking away, except to blink, for about 20 minutes. Of course, he didn't understand the significance of that amount of time anyway, but he would soon, whether he liked it or not. As the guard watched the unmoving doll on his monitor, eyes slowly unfocusing from staring for too long, he suddenly had the feeling that he was being watched. He knew it was irrational. There wasn't even a camera in this room, but he still felt that crawling on the back of his neck, that burn of a gaze on his back. Then he heard it. Faint at first, so faint he could almost pretend he was imagining it. Almost. But there was no doubt about it. He could hear a distant, muffled voice. It wasn't saying anything, not that he could identify anyway. It didn't seem to be speaking at all. It was laughing, but it wasn't a joyful laugh, a genuine laugh at something funny or surprising. It was hollow, sharp, cold. It was the laugh of someone, something, mocking him. The sound of it made every hair stand up. Once, when he was in high school, he went camping with a group of friends. In the middle of the night, he heard a shrieking sound mere feet from his tent. It sent his body into high alert just like this, terrified him on such a primal and fundamental level that he could do nothing but lie there, staring at the wall of his tent, holding his breath until he heard footsteps retreating from the campsite. He later learned that the noise had been a mountain lion, and his body had responded instinctually with the kind of ancestral fear reserved for a deadly predator. He never experienced anything like that again, until today, until this doll, and that laugh. But where is it coming from? He turned away from the monitor, scanning every inch of the bare little room. Of course, there's nothing in there. There's no one but him. Nothing but the monitor and the doll in the next room. But there was the laugh again, ringing in his ears louder now than it was before. It was as if it was getting closer, circling him like the mountain lion circled his tent, like a predator toying with its prey. He heard the laugh again, this time as clear as if it were coming from right behind him. He spun around instinctively, but he knew there would be nothing there. He turned back to the monitor, stomach sinking like a stone. This had something to do with the doll. It had to. There was no way it was a coincidence. But the doll still hadn't moved, and it sat there in the same place, expression unchanged. He rubbed his eyes, willing the whole thing to be some sort of stress-induced hallucination. When he opened his eyes, he saw two new eyes staring back at him through the screen. They were wide, bloodshot pupils dilated far bigger than they should be able to. He jumped at the sight, nearly falling out of the chair. The eyes were so shocking, he almost didn't notice who they belonged to. There was a naked woman standing in the room where the doll was only a moment ago. Her hair was wild, tangled, and filthy, as if she had run through a thicket of brambles. Her eyes were crazed, unblinking, and somehow fixed on him through the camera. Her mouth was twisted into a painful grin, every single tooth on display without an ounce of genuine pleasure or happiness. And she was walking right toward him, or rather, walking right toward the camera. She moved slowly, like she was pushing through water, but she moved steadily, relentlessly. The guard felt frozen in place, muscles refusing to move no matter how much every cell in his body screamed for him to run. The strange, horrible woman moved closer and closer, until her face was all that the camera could see. He forced himself to move, standing up from his chair and reaching for the power button on the monitor. Forget the job. He would do whatever it took to make this awful sight disappear. Then, the unthinkable happened. The face came closer and closer and closer still. It pushed through the screen, eyes bulging out through the monitor, as the nightmarish vision crossed from the video feed into the room with him. The guard opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His terror paralyzed his vocal cords and strangled the sound in his throat. The bloodshot eyes, the twisted smile, the pallid corpse-like skin. All of it was coming out of the screen and was headed right for him. First came the head, then the shoulders, the arms, the torso, the legs, stepping out onto the floor and taking the same slow-motion strides toward him. The figure reached out, its arms, fingers stretched out as if to grab the guard by the shirt, and he stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. Just as her fingertips brushed against his chest, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving the guard alone in the room, heart pounding, eyes filled with fearful tears. He threw open the door and sprinted to his superior's office, shouting all the way. He spluttered out an explanation, begging the head of security to come and take a look at what had happened with the doll. But when the older man followed him to the room, there was nothing there. Just an overturned office chair and an ongoing video feed of a room, empty save for a doll. But wait a minute, the doll was different now. It was a little cloth poppet with an embroidered face and hair made of yarn, wrapped in a floral patterned dress. The head of security wrote the entire thing off as first-day jitters and told the new guard not to waste his time again. He returned to his office and left the guard alone with his monitor, the footage of the new doll, and a tenuous grip on his own sense of reality. Had he really just imagined that? It seemed unlikely. But unfortunately, there was only one way to know for sure. He returned his chair to its original position, sat down, and looked at the monitor again. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. 10 minutes passed. Still nothing. He was beginning to wonder if his boss was right, or maybe he had fallen asleep without realizing, and had some stress-induced nightmare that had blurred with the waking world just enough to confuse him. But then he passed the 20-minute mark, and he heard that distant, mocking laughter again. His blood turned to ice in his veins, and he shuddered at the sound. He knew what was coming, just as he knew that he was powerless to stop it. He watched the monitor, waiting for the woman to appear again, but she wasn't there. There was only the doll. The laugh grew louder and louder, coming closer and closer until it was right next to his ear. It was so close he could practically feel hot breath ghosting across his cheek, but there was no woman on the monitor. He should have been relieved, but the dread only grew. If she wasn't there, where was she? Slowly he turned his head, looking from side to side. Nothing to the left of him, nothing to the right. He didn't want to look in the only remaining place, but he had to. It was the only way to know. He turned and glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there either. Then came that laugh again, higher pitched and more frantic than before. It sounded like mad, violent glee, like something that couldn't wait to tear him to pieces. It seemed to echo through the room and bounce off of every wall, off the ceiling. No, it couldn't be. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes drift upward. His heart skipped a beat as he saw her there, clinging to the ceiling like a giant insect, arms akimbo, head cocked to the side, eyes even wider than before. She crawled down the wall and began her slow march toward him, smile filled with malice. She hadn't done anything to him yet, other than terrify him to his core, but he had a feeling that if she managed to catch him, whatever that meant, it would be all over. He wasn't going to just sit here and let her get him. He stood up, backing away from the ghostly figure, and ran down the hall to the head of security's office again. The guard turned in his resignation right there and walked out of the Foundation site for good. He'd go get a job in a mall or something. The pay wouldn't be as good, but at least there wouldn't be any haunted dolls. But it was already too late. The nightmare was beginning to spread through the SCP Foundation. Throughout the site, people who had no idea the doll was even there began to encounter the same apparition. One researcher was making a cup of coffee when he opened the refrigerator to grab a carton of milk. Inside, he found the figure waiting for him. Wild eyes and wicked grin, arms outstretched as if to grab him. He shrieked and dropped the milk, spilling it across the floor. On the other side of the site, a research assistant was sneaking in a nap at his desk when his pleasant dreams turned to nightmares. He imagined himself walking down a darkened hallway and feeling something following close behind. He turned around and saw nothing there. It was far too dark. But then a light flickered on, and there was a woman walking a few feet behind him, grinning maniacally. The light blinked off, then back on. She was a few steps closer than she had been. The light flicked off again, then on. She was even closer. He tried to run, but the light continued to flicker, and the woman came closer and closer. He felt her icy hands brush the back of his neck and woke up screaming. A researcher was making copies when she spotted the same woman through the window, walking slowly toward her. She watched in horror as the woman walked right through the wall, phasing through it like a ghost. The on-site psychologist received a record number of walk-in appointments as staff from all across the site reported disturbing visions of a woman with bloodshot eyes and a stomach-churning smile, walking toward them with unknown, but certainly not positive, intent. Soon, the site director spoke to the head of security, who reported the guard's sudden resignation earlier that day. It all led back to that doll, the newly acquired SCP-136. The item's file was sealed to all those who hadn't been responsible for its recovery, but when it was opened for review, it started to make sense. The doll had done this before, and even caused an injury to a field agent during the recovery process. The site director ordered that video surveillance of the item be suspended indefinitely in order to avoid indirectly activating the item. The guard assigned to the position after the previous guard resigned was found slumped over in their chair, unconscious. Nothing was medically wrong with them, but when they woke up, they reported having, quote, the worst nightmare. They were sent home early, and the monitor was switched off for good. Whatever SCP-136 wanted to get up to alone in its containment, that was its business. They didn't have to give it the audience it so clearly wanted, not unless it served a purpose. For example, the site director was beginning to wonder, could they use the anomaly to enhance interrogations? Fear could certainly be a powerful tool in the right hands. Now go check out SCP-136 Naked Doll, or What Does SCP-056 Do Alone While in Containment for more.